Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm continuing on my series of Penultimate Juror Rankings for some reason. Where again, I guess it's just the thing I do, is that when I do a big ranking for Survivor US, I just do it for every other major international Survivor series, and here we're doing it for Survivor South Africa, which I'm sure so many people are excited for, but we got 9 players to rank here. Again, these are all the penultimate jurors, people that were taken out 2 rounds before the end of the game, because I've obviously already done final jurors, I've already done runners up, so we're getting as far back as penultimate jurors now. So again, 9 people to rank here. Let's get started. At number 9, the worst penultimate juror of Survivor South Africa ends up being MXO from Survivor South Africa Maldives, who just kind of sucks. He was kind of just there. He didn't really actively do much. He was just kind of following the lead of whoever was from his original tribe. Again, despite him getting 4th place on this season, he really just does not do much, and also gets into confrontations, pisses people off. He didn't seem to have any true win equity in the game. And again, just like didn't seem to really do much in the game. He was just kind of there. He's kind of on the bottom alongside the other celebs on his original tribe. And really just ends up following the lead of the likes of Allison, Sean, and Simon for most of the game. Like he's kind of just there without doing that much and had no win equity. I mean, I don't think there's anything really positive to say about his game, so he's here at number 9. At number 8, and I'm straight up, like outside of MXO, I feel like the rest of this list is actually pretty okay. I think all of the rest of these players are people that have pretty major positives for their games. However, these next 2 are kind of in a sub-tier of their own. And at number 8, we're starting that off with Survivor South Africa Santa Carolina. We do have Sade. And Sade is an interesting player in the sense that she was in a pretty good spot for a lot of the game. I mean, the first half of the game, she was in a pretty powerful position. She was in the core majority alliance, only for her own allies to get taken out one by one in the post-merge, with them losing the numbers right away there. Though she does end up, alongside Gigi, building a strong bond with Ashley Hayden that keeps her in the game, and she ends up working alongside Gigi until she's eventually cut by them at the final 4. Again, it's a solid-ish game. I mean, it's a game where, again, she was in a good spot for the first half of it, and in the second half, she got pretty unlucky with how things played out, but even then was able to recover slightly, at least for a little bit. And I think Sade is a solid player here. I mean, the reason she's not higher is because I do feel like a lot of her post-merge, at least the good aspects of it, were her being kind of led around by Ashley Hayden, being told by her what to do. Also, the fact that she's cut by her and Gigi at the final 4, I think is a pretty bad aspect of her game, as I don't really feel like she had a true path to the end. And the fact that she wasn't able to convince someone like Gigi to even keep her there in a position where I do think it greatly benefited Gigi to do so, again, I think that's not great. So, again, I think it's a game that, again, there are positives there for sure, particularly in the first half of the game, but I do think the second half of the game is pretty rocky, and the circumstances around her eventual vote off are pretty damning to her. So, again, that's why she's here at number 8. At number 7, we're moving on to a player that is just barely above Sade. Again, I don't think this person's flawless either, but at number 7, we do have a Zayn from Survivor South Africa Panama Season 1. And again, Zayn is a pretty interesting player to me in the sense that he was in the majority for pretty much the entire season. He was working alongside Gareth pretty closely and was part of the group that had the numbers post-merge, and they really just ran the show. Took out Lizelle, and he was supposed to be in the final 3 before obviously the twist occurred where Vanessa and Imsy come back. Now, I do think there are a couple negatives for him in the sense that he seemed to kind of be on the bottom of his original alliance. Like, while they do eventually vote off Lizelle over him, I do feel like he was probably the less ingrained within that group for most of the season. Though, again, I think he does some decent work in the fact that he does build bonds with the people outside of his alliance, like the minority coming into their merge and having pretty good relationships with Zayn, which, to be fair, they take advantage of that, and that's part of why the final 5 vote happens in the way it does, where Gareth gets taken out and he loses all control of the game. But again, like, there are good aspects to his game for sure. Like, I think if he were at the final 2 against really anybody from his original tribe, he probably ends up winning due to those jury votes. So again, that is pretty impressive. And the fact that, again, he was in the original final 3, really, really close to getting to the end, again, that is pretty good for him. But overall, I just feel like his game is like a bit unstable. He's kind of just on the bottom of his alliance for most of the game. It doesn't really do anything to change that. And the vote off of Lizelle felt more so just Lizelle playing poorly than him doing anything actually right. But I will say something that puts him above Sade is the fact that he doesn't get voted out. He gets taken out by a challenge in a spot where, had that final 4 challenge been an actual immunity challenge, more than likely Jacinda gets voted out there, and he gets to another final 3 there, where if he gets to the end, he's a very likely winner, just due to the fact that most people are voting down tribal lines. Now, I will say Jacinda is probably the person that's least likely to vote for Zayn, and that's not particularly great, but there's definitely some major positives for Zayn's game on this season. But again, I just think my biggest criticism criticism of his game is his lack of activeness and getting him outside of that minority group. It really just feels like he kind of lucks his way into those positions, even though he does do some good work at building bonds with people in the minorities. So again, it's kind of a mixed bag, but overall I did land him here at number 7. Now number 6, we're moving on to a player that had a very rocky season. Like, this is a person whose game I'm very conflicted on how to assess this person's game, because there's major highs and there's major lows. But at number 6, I'm going to go with Phil from Survivor South Africa, Return of the Outcast. And like, Phil is a player that I think comes out of this season with a pretty good reputation in terms of gameplay, at least, to where while he kind of botches it at the end, I do think people for the most part are pretty high on Phil. However, I think when like actually looking at the grand scope of his game, again, it's just a very rocky game. I mean, it's one where he does do good work early on. Again, he is part of the initial majority on the pre-mergers tribe, and he has his instant bond with Felix and Dino, and they flip the vote to take out Tevin. Despite being in the minority coming into the swap, he's able to be the one that avoids getting any votes on him, which I think is indicative of his social play there. And once we get to the merge, again, he does do some pretty decent work in pulling off the Stephie blindside. But I feel like that's where his game kind of crumbles. I feel like the rest of his game is just very rocky, and he flips back to take out Meryl, which I do think is a pretty misguided play from him. He then loses trust of Felix and ends up actively taking Felix out, despite Felix should have been his number 1 ally in the game. He essentially puts himself in this position where he needs to win out, and he ends up winning 3 immunities in a row, only to be eventually taken out at 4. Again, to me, it's just a very rocky game at the end there. Again, like, I think up to the final 9, I think it is a solid game. It's still not like a top tier game, but it is a very, very good one. But it just really crumbles towards the end, where I think he plays really disastrously. And again, like, it is kind of tough to reconcile those two things. Now, if he does get to the end, I think he probably wins a jury vote. Though even then, I think it would be relatively close between him and Dino and him and Marion. Or even that's not really a guarantee, and he was still 2 rounds away from doing so. So I feel like Phil's game is a bit rough to assess here, but at the end of the day, I did end up going with number 6 for him. Now moving on to number 5, and here we do have a player that has another pretty strange game to assess, and that person is Stephie from Survivor South Africa, Island of Secrets. And I think there's a serious debate for putting Phil higher, probably in the fact that Phil probably had more win equity by the end of the game, also probably had more direct points where he controlled the game than Stephie. However, I think Stephie was a bit more of a stable presence in the game. I mean, Stephie was pretty loyal to the likes of Rob and Nicole for most of the game and kind of remains alongside them and stays in the majority alongside them for most of the game. Now, again, I do think she does some poor social play at points. She wasn't particularly loved by the cast, and she wasn't that well respected, to where even if she had gotten to the end, she probably wasn't winning. But again, like, she remained in the majority for really most of the game, and even towards the end of the game started to organize this plan to take out Rob that seemed like it was going to go through until Rob won Final 5 immunity. Where it felt like at that point, that's when Nicole finally backed out of the plan. Like, I feel like Stephie, again, plays a pretty solid game here if you don't take into effect the fact that she had almost no win equity. Or again, even if her plan had gone through and she gets to the final 3 that she wanted of her, Nicole, and Letitia, she probably still ends up losing that final 3 to Nicole. Though, again, the fact that she was still able to organize that plan, again, against one of the best players to ever play Survivor, I think is a pretty impressive thing there. And also her vote off ends up being, again, a very strange one. Now, technically, she would have been voted out naturally if there were no idols in play anyway. As either way, Rob, Nicole, and Doral still had the majority, but she essentially does get taken out by default just due to the fact that everyone else had an idol, which is pretty insane as well. So again, like, I just feel like Stephie plays a solid enough game here. Again, a pretty stable game, a game that, again, like, had this big move set up at the very end that crumbles at the last second. But unlike Phil, I feel like there's no real point here where she falls out of the majority. Or at least that's something where it lands there at number 5 for me. Now number 4, and I feel like these top 4 are all pretty good, actually. I feel like these are pretty solid players of these seasons. But at number 4, I'm going to go with the person that I think probably played it less actively, and that person is Manla from Survivor South Africa, Malaysia. And I think Manla's an interesting player on this season because I do think he is someone that I think you could argue is the most dominant player of this season. I think he is a person that was pretty well positioned on his original tribe. Now, he was technically on the outs of the first vote, but he's able to recover beyond that and has this really strong relationship with Lorette that carries him through the game. And once his tribe gets the numbers coming into the merge. He's really able to control things, ends up being in the best position within that, with the other side going for Grant and Angie more so than him. And then he's also able to control the Angie vote at Final 5 alongside Lorette. And again, like, he is technically running things for most of this season. But like Lorette, I do struggle with like the concept of like how much of this was actually strategic. Now, I do think Manla was out in front more than Lorette, and I think Manla seemed to get the game a bit more than Lorette, though at the same time, he was also planning on throwing the game to Lorette, where he talked about how he wanted to give Lorette the win, which is also not great. But also something to factor in here is the fact that he really does get screwed over of being someone that makes it further in the game through the fact that he loses a challenge to get taken out of the game, like Zayn, which, I did struggle with what to do with those sort of players, as I did question, like, okay, does this mean that they're like screwed over players that would typically be at the top of this list? I decided to not go that route simply because it was part of the actual format of the show during the early days. It wasn't this like twist that was sprung up on them out of nowhere. But at the same time, again, like, Manla gets screwed over of at least being a runner-up probably, where again, Lorette wins the Final 4 challenge. If that was just a normal vote, Amanda probably goes home, and she also wins Final Immunity, where she probably takes Manla to the end. So again, like, Manla was pretty much guaranteed Final 2 if he had not lost the Final 4 challenge, in a position where, again, I don't know what happens there. I mean, I still think there's definitely a chance that Manla throws the game and gives it to Lorette, tells everyone to vote for Lorette, and considering how sympathetic the jury as is seemed to be towards Lorette and her needing the money, I would not be shocked if they did vote for Lorette. But at the same time, without Manla on the jury, that also means Lorette only gets 2 sympathy votes, where at that point it kind of comes down to Grant on who wins at that point, which, again, not fully sure where he goes. But again, like, Manla plays a very interesting game here. Again, I think there's definitely an argument for him being higher simply due to the fact that he gets screwed over in the end game and was just pretty close to potentially winning the game. But I just feel like the fact that he wasn't playing for himself, was playing more so to give Lorette the win. And also, I do struggle with how much strategy he was really incorporating into his game, and I think that's what makes me struggle putting him higher here than number 4. Next up at number 3, we're moving on to a player that I really think ran a lot of his season, particularly with another person, though they really end up losing control at the end of the game. And at number 3, I'm going with Tyson from Survivor South Africa Immunity Island, who, again, I think he ran the game alongside Kieran. I think they were really well positioned for a good chunk of the game. Obviously, they do come to swap down numbers, but even then are able to use an idol to get out of that, which, I'm too fair, again, that should be knocked technically on Tyson, the fact that he did need an idol in that situation. But that was also a situation where they actively put the votes on Tyson for him to use the idol successfully, where most people actually wanted Tyson to survive that round. So again, I'm not going to really fault him too much for that. But we also later have his idol play on Chappies, which gets them the majority after the merge, which they really hold control of the merge for really a lot of the post-merge. Again, they take out Sean, take out Rainier, they flip the vote on Anesu, winning the battle for Anella and Nicole's votes. They do lose Wardall, though, again, that's largely due to a lot of twists and idol plays. But really, I think a big thing that really screws them over is Chappie's immunity run, where had it not been for Chappie's just winning over and over and over again, Tyson and Kieran probably have a much easier path to the end, though obviously through Chappie's staying in the game longer and longer allows him to pick up Anella and Nicole and really flip the game on them. So again, I think in a way they definitely got screwed over by Chappie's immunity run, and really beyond that, obviously his vote off is a very wonky one where he essentially just quits the game. He essentially votes himself out on purpose, which again, don't really know how to fully assess that. But I do think most of his game up to that point is very strong though. Again, I do think his game really up until the final 6 is pretty impressive, just how much they're running the game, but it just completely crumbles around them just due to the fact that Chappie's keeps on winning out. But I still find the game overall very impressive, and that's why he's here number 3. Now number 2, and this might be a bit of a surprise to people, as I do think my number 2 player on this list is a better player overall. At least I look at him as a better player than the number 1 person on the list. However, I think when assessing their games, even though this person probably had more control than the person at number 1, I do believe this person also had more faults in their end game than the person at number 1. And at number 2, I am going with Werner from Survivor South Africa, Philippines. Now, I should also clarify, yes, technically Werner wasn't a juror. He got voted off of the jury. However, he was voted out in the penultimate juror spot, which is enough for me to put him on the list. I mean, the reason why I categorize these people together is because they've played the same amount of game. And that makes it easier to assess their games together because obviously they had the same opportunities in the game, theoretically. So I can understand the argument of like, okay, he wasn't technically a juror, so he shouldn't be on this list. But again, for my criteria, I feel like I'm still going to include him here. And again, like Werner, I think plays a very dominant game on this season. Like, it's a pretty impressive game. I mean, early on, things definitely looked not necessarily rocky, but it looked like he was just a bit of a chaotic player. But he kind of starts to control things and being a major player and getting Stacey Lee out and then Ace. And from that point on, he really just takes control of his tribe and really never lets go from that point forward. I mean, his group does come into the merge in numbers and takes out Vusi. And while he is a target for the minority moving forward, he still is able to survive the immunity train and pick up Tom and blindside Palessa, flip the game on Tony and PK. However, a major issue, obviously, with Werner, kind of like an added reason why he's not number one on this list, is because he does lose control at the final five. And he does have people in his own group that end up coming after him. I mean, Katinka and Annalise does plotting to blindside Werner, only for him to obviously get the upper hand on them and take out Katinka. But even then, that's not even enough, as the following round, even Jean, the person who he saved in the previous round, and Tom, the person he organized the previous vote with, end up flipping on him immediately afterwards. So, as much as Werner dominated up until the final five, I do think the final five on, he really just loses control and really had no real way of keeping that control. We're really just everyone flips on him. And I think an added negative to all this is that I'm still unsure about Werner's win equity. So where, despite the fact that many people thought Werner was controlling the game, a lot of the jury seemed to just not really respect Werner. At least at the time they got voted out, they seemed to be upset at Werner, particularly like Zavusi. To where, again, I do find myself a bit unsure if he would have won the game. I suspect he probably would have, especially because by the end, the people that were like bitter at Tom end up voting for Tom over Jean at the end. And while I think like someone like Vusi was probably a lost cause for Werner, I do feel like Werner probably still gets the votes of like Shanae and Palessa eventually, especially against the likes of a Jean. But again, I do think his win equity is still a little bit up in the air. So I think there's definitely faults to his game. He definitely did control a lot of the game. He is definitely the most dominant player of the people on the list here. But I just feel like the person at number one got a bit more screwed over. And at the end of the day, I think Werner's game definitely has some major holes towards the end game, which is the reason why I have him at number two. Now, number one, moving on to a player that I look at this person as screwed over. Like, while I don't think this person played as dominant of a game as Werner, I do think this person pretty much had the game won until a very unlucky circumstance happened, and that person is Zavon from Survivor South Africa Champions. Yeah, I think Zavon surprisingly plays a very strong game, because I did think Zavon early on looked very rocky, obviously. He tried to control his tribe from the offset, only for Graham to flip the vote on him, taking out his closest ally in Ashley. And his side proceeds to get taken out afterwards, like a Marsha and a Philip getting taken out. But again, I do think Zavon does pretty good work in reingratiating himself within the majority. He builds his relationship with Graham, that solidifies after a swap, that makes him this really strong power duo after the merge, to where they get together with David and really start running the entire game. I mean, they're flipping back and forth between the sides and taking out Marion, then Solly, then Moira, which the Moira move in particular, I think is a move that's much better for Zavon than it is for Graham to execute. You also have the Shane vote off, again, taking out someone with two idols in his pocket. However, obviously his game ends at the final five. But again, that's a situation where he just gets kind of unlucky. Unlucky in the fact that Sivu has an idol that wasn't even supposed to be valid in the game, as that was Shane's idol, where Shane got voted out with it, left it back at camp. Or again, if this had been most other versions of the show, this would not even be a real idol. And again, it does screw over Zavon here, where I think there's a serious chance where if this idol play was not in play, and we do get to the Graham, David, Zavon final three, I think Zavon has that pretty handily. Like, I do think Graham definitely gets votes, but I do think it should be a pretty easy Zavon win. So again, I feel like Zavon was essentially a player that was pretty screwed over here. I do think Zavon was in a pretty good spot to win the game, though gets that game sniped from him, largely due to the fact that, again, this idol that shouldn't have been in the game was technically still in the game, and also gets unlucky in the fact that Graham had won immunity that round, where I think otherwise there would have at least been a chance that they vote for Graham instead of Zavon in that position. So again, like, I do think this is a game where Zavon gets mostly screwed over. And while his game isn't as fully dominant as the likes of Werner, I do feel like the fact that he was as screwed over as he was the reason why I do have him here number one. But there we go. I mean, that is my penultimate juror ranking for Survivor South Africa. Now, following this, I will end up doing an Australian Survivor penultimate juror ranking as well, so stay tuned for that. And obviously, outside of that, just expect the typical content you could expect from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.